sections of the Siddur. These are sections of prayer that apply to every day of the year. Some of them are augmented based on whether it's Shabbat or it's a holiday. Some of them stay the same regardless. So the first one is Birchot HaShachar, the morning blessings, and I put what pages these can be found in the Siddur. And these are always the same. These stay the same all year round, every day of the year. The Sukkei de Zimra, these are the verses of praise that do vary. So on a regular weekday, it's shorter. On a Shabbat, it's a little bit longer. On a holiday, there will be even an additional psalm or two that's included. That will be included in order to reflect the theme of the holiday. Then you have the Shema, which if you turn to the next page, where we have the Shema and the Amidah. The Shema and the Amidah are kind of like the meat and potatoes of the Tefillah. The Shema has 2 blessings before and 1 after, and then you have the Amidah, which during the week is made up of 19 blessings, and on Shabbat is made up of 7 blessings. The first 3 and the last 3 are always the same. The middle changes. So if you think of it, like we said last time, as a sandwich that's always made with whole wheat bread. So the bread is always the same, but what goes in the middle changes. You could have a very simple sandwich. Shabbat has just 1 blessing in between the 3 openers and the 3 closers. Weekday you have, a whole slew of blessings in the middle. You have 13. And on Yom Kippur you have a very long one. On Rosh Hashanah you have certain special ones for Rosh Hashanah and summer. So this was the overview that we did. Now, I thought since we wanted to talk a little bit about history tonight and the evolution of Tefillah, so I was going to throw out a question and see who knows the answer to this question.
Should we just start to read it?
Is someone in the elevator?
But it has
It
the
could be that they're
from the
Russians.
blue
Russians
book.
are here to work.
Oh.
It could be.
Yeah,
We have a new sheet that shows the page numbers in the Siddur. It's the same thing except it has the pages in the
So
Siddur.
if you had the book, you could see.
For the book, you have it. That's it.
Everything is the same.
No, you have it. It's the same.
It's the same.
You got it.
It's the same.
There you go. Okay, so I thought an interesting question, an interesting way to approach this would be to look at the layers in the Siddur, historical layers. Like imagine we're on an archaeological dig. So the way that they date things is they look at layers in the ground. So you find a civilization from, let's say, 5,000 years ago, and then on top of that you find something that's from 4,000 years ago, and so on as you go through the layers. So what is the oldest part of the prayer? Let's start with that. What is the oldest, and how do you know it's the oldest?
Shema, because it's from the Torah.
Okay, so that's the easiest, right? That's the easiest. Okay, within the Shema, what are the oldest parts? That's a really hard one.
Well, Tzit.
There are 3 paragraphs.
Yeah.
And within the Shema
Yisrael itself.
I would say,
You have 3
listen,
paragraphs.
people.
Where you have Shema Yisrael. You have the second longer paragraph that talks about reward and punishment. It talks about keeping the mitzvot. And then you have the tzitzit. The paragraph talks about tzitzit and the Exodus that we talked about last time. So of these, which is the oldest one? Anybody have a guess? This is somewhat of a tougher question. But you can cheat by looking.
Let's look.
If you know a little bit about the order of the Torah, you could figure it out. It's a riddle.
Well, it can't be the third part because it's the Exodus.
Guess what? It's paradoxical. The third paragraph is really the oldest part. Why?
Really?
Because
Very good, Shelley.
always guess the answer that seems to be the wackiest that could be right. Why? Why is that? Because Deuteronomy, Devarim, is at the end of Moshe's life before he dies. Everything else up to that, more or less, is in the first 2 years or so that they were in the desert. Okay? Before the 40 years of wandering. When was the Parashat Tzitzit given? Right before the rebellion of Korah, if you remember the history. Which was right after it was decreed that they weren't going into the land and they were going to wander for 40 years.
Well, the reference to Tzit was because Korach was accusing Moshe of being disingenuous about a certain law or commandment, and he said, "Well, you can have tzitzit, but you can't do such and such."
If you wear a blue garment, you need tzitzit.
You need tzitzit.
Right, that was the whole question. But the reason why is because of the juxtaposition. In the Torah itself, the mitzvah tzitzit comes right before the story of Korah.
Before what?
Right before the story of Korah, who rebelled against Moshe. And one of the reasons why he rebelled against Moshe was because Moshe said, we're going to be wandering here for the next 39 years, and you guys are never going to go into the land. So the mitzvah of tzitzit was given to the Jews.
Yay!
It was given to the Jews 39 years before Moshe died, let's say, or 38 years, roughly, something like that. 38 years, 39 years. So that means it's really the oldest.
So Devarim is really just covers the last 2 years before they go.
Devarim is really the end, the last several months that Moshe was alive. Yeah, the last several months that Moshe was alive, he's giving the speeches in Devarim. So the Shema followed, the first two paragraphs are in chronological order because the first one is Devarim 6 and the second one is Devarim 11. So it's following chronological order. But the third paragraph is, so to speak, out of order. The third paragraph is really the earliest. Okay? So that's just something to note. But the basic answer is that the three paragraphs of the Shema are the earliest, the lowest strata of the archaeological dig. If you're looking at the Shema, if you're looking at the Siddur and trying to determine what's the oldest piece, the oldest part is going to be the Shema. Now, after the Shema, what is the next, historically speaking, what is going to be the next oldest piece? It's not. Good guess, but no. It's a good guess because it's very fundamental, but it's not the oldest in age. So one is from Mosaic times, right? Moshe's times, it's going back very far. So of course it's the oldest. Now what's the next oldest?
We're talking about this in the Siddur.
Yeah, the content that's in the Siddur, when it was actually written, what would be the next most ancient after Moshe? Abraham obviously didn't write anything in the Siddur, so he's not in there. But the next oldest is going to be anything from Tehillim. Anything from Psalms. In other words, anything biblical is already taking me back to pre-rabbinic times. Much of the prayer, I would say, the vast majority of what we're going to talk about was composed in what's called the Second Temple period, which is from about the 5th century BCE, 5th century before 0, until about the year 70. This is called the time of the Second Temple. This is when the bulk of the tefillot, as we know them, Kiddush, Havdalah, all of these things were created at that time, were formalized at that time. So that's already, in Jewish terms, that's like modern. In Jewish terms. Because if we're thinking in the biblical sense. So go back to the Bible, you go back to Moshe, you're going back to, let's say, the 13th century or 14th century BCE, depending on which archaeologist you ask, 15th century BCE. They have all kinds of different opinions. If you go to King David, so you're already moving after the times of Moshe about, not quite, but about 400 years, let's say.
That's the
like
Psalms. That's when
Psalms, yeah.
That's the second oldest.
Because it says that it says in the book of Kings that the first temple was built 480 years after the Jews left Egypt. So that was the time of Solomon already. So let's say around 400 years-ish is King David. So anything from Psalms, so the Psukei de Zimra that we read in the morning, in terms of when it was written in the times of King David. It was also, there were some parts of the Psalms that were written later and were included, but the bulk of it was written in the times of David. And so that's a further strata. Let's say that's about, that's 400 years even later than that. Now, what's interesting is, so after Psalms, after the Shema, which of course is literally from the Torah, then you have the Psalms, and then after that you have, for the most part, things that were created by what we call Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. Anshe Knesset HaGedolah is called in English the men of the Great Assembly, which is just a translation of Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. This was a court of rabbis that existed. It doesn't seem like it was just one generation. It seems like it was a body of rabbis that existed for a few generations. And it was started by Ezra. Ezra was the leader who brought the Jews back to Israel after they had been in Babylonian exile for 70 years. So what kind of problems? Now remember, what do they already have? They already have the Shema. Because we know that's from the Torah. They already have that. They already have they already have the book of Psalms, of course, written by King David. They had the Bible up to the times of Ezra, but that was all they had in liturgy.
But wait a minute, Ezra preceded the King David.
No, King David's in the first temple. Ezra built second temple.
Okay, excuse me.
Yeah. So
Okay.
King David is way before,
Okay.
several centuries before. Ezra is like second temple.
Yeah,
King
yeah,
David
yeah.
is several hundred years before that, first temple.
Okay.
So let's say about 4 or 5 centuries before. So in the Babylonian exile, so the Jews were exiled to Babylonia. They were there for 70 years, which means, an entire 2 generations were in Babylonia. Most of the people that came back, except for the elderly people, had never seen Israel before. They had lived their entire lives in Babylonia. Now, they come back to Babylonia, and they need to reestablish a community in the land of Israel. And part of that is they have a problem. What are some of the problems that they're going to have? Like, think about the Jews who came to Israel, the immigrants who started the state of Israel. So what was one of the things that they had to do?
To build the land.
Hmm?
To build the land.
Well, they have to build the land. That was a big deal.
The problem,
What about culturally, though?
Language.
What language does everybody speak when they come back? Aramaic. They spoke Aramaic. They didn't speak Hebrew.
But the problem was deeper because they didn't have temple, they didn't have the holy of the holy.
Right. Well, that they worked on, that they built.
Yeah.
But they didn't have the language. So they could read the Torah and they could read the Tehillim with translation into Aramaic. That's why we have all these translations into Aramaic. Because that was the vernacular at the time. Now you have to go to school to learn to read the Aramaic. It's harder than the Hebrew, because Hebrew now is a spoken language. But Aramaic is not really a spoken language, so we have to study it. But the Talmud and much of Jewish literature from the Second Temple times is written in Aramaic, because that was what people spoke. Now when it comes to prayer, what are they going to do? They have a big problem. What are the people probably praying in?
Aramaic.
Whatever they're comfortable with, right? Aramaic. They're not going to pray in Hebrew because they're not fluent in it. But now they come to the land of Israel and they want to be Israelis. So they want to speak Lashon HaKodesh. We're in Israel now. But nobody speaks it well enough, really, to be able to articulate prayer. It's one thing to be able to say how much for a cup of coffee in Hebrew. It's another thing to be able to say prayers in Hebrew. So Maimonides says when they came to Israel, they had a problem. They spoke, and actually even the Bible describes it. The Tanakh describes, in the times of Ezra and Nehemiah, they spoke a mix of Hebrew, a jumbled Hebrew with Aramaic, with all kinds of other languages that they were exposed to. Nobody really spoke fluently one language. So they wanted to have a language of prayer that everybody could relate to. You're going to have Kiddush on Friday nights, or you're going to say silent prayer. If everybody's saying a different thing in a different language, it doesn't work. So they wanted to structure it. One of the things Ezra and Nehemiah and this group called the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah did, which modern Judaism is pretty much entirely the result of their work, was to structure things. Everything that we have that is structured is from them. How do you say Kiddush? You don't just get up and say, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. It's a wonderful evening. Thanks for coming. Let's drink to that. No, there's a text of Kiddush. Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu melech haolam, borei peri hagefen, mikadesh Shabbat. All of these things, they said we need to have a structure. We need to have a structure, formality. So before that, all they had was the Bible. And if you wanted to say prayer, you said a silent prayer by yourself. They said, no, we need to give it structure. We can't have everybody doing their own thing in their own language.
But because we didn't have the temple, we started to pray.
Right. No, that's not.
So
Listen,
they changed it.
that's like something that many people say, but it's not true. There was always tefillah. There was always tefillah. Even when they had the Beit HaMikdash.
Because they make it, it's like tradition twice a week, they change the law as long that,
Even during the times of the Beit HaMikdash, they had tefillah 3 times a day. Daniel had 3 times a day.
3 times a day, yes.
Right.
But instead of, go to the Holy of the Holies, they start to pray together, like twice a week on
the Torah, reading the Torah.
Yeah, reading
The Torah.
on
Ezra started the Torah readings and everything. That is true because he wanted to educate the people. They were uneducated. It would be like taking a bunch of assimilated Americans back to Israel and saying, okay, now we're going to go back to following the Torah. They don't even know what's written in it. How are they going to do that? So he had to educate them, definitely. But in terms of structure, of tefillot, of brachot, everything that we take for granted, like what does every bracha start with? Baruch atah. That all came from the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. Somebody didn't just accidentally come up with that. So all the structure came from them. Everybody had the Shema, they had Tehillim, but that was it. The rabbis of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah decided we need to formalize things and structure everything. And so,
what? I'm sorry, what is that expression?
This is a group of rabbis and prophets in the Second Temple called Men of the Great Assembly. It's called in Hebrew Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. So they
Don't
made.
read about
Is
the
that
Passover? What? We're not talking about that same.
They were later. The rabbis agreed on Passover.
Is that the same thing as a Sanhedrin?
It was a type of Sanhedrin.
Okay.
What is Sanhedrin? Is that
It just means a court.
A court.
Yeah, it was a type of, yeah. So they made this structure, and this is the structure that we still have today. Now, the key things that they did were, if we go back to our list, and we want to figure out the strata, again, you want to go to the next level. Things that they did include the Amidah. Okay? The Amidah, Shmona Esrei. So that 3 brachot in the beginning, we said there were 3 blessings of praise, 3 concluding blessings of thanks, and whatever is in the middle. All of those things, Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, they formalized them. That doesn't mean that people weren't praying before. It just means that there wasn't a structure. They gave it a structure. The blessings that come before and after the Shema, Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, they were the ones who made these blessings. Okay, so that is so to speak, the third layer. You have Mosaic, the things from Moshe, the Shema. You have Tehillim. Now you have Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the Great Assembly, who did the Amidah. They also wrote the Kiddush, Havdalah, things like that. Now, next level is in the times of the Talmud. So what happens?
When is that?
Okay, so I'm gonna tell you. So when we think of the Talmudic times, it's a little bit difficult to put a start date. It's easier to put an end date, but because there was overlap. The Second Temple existed from the 5th century until the year 70. Now, in the middle of that period of the Second Temple is really where many of the rabbis who we think of as famous rabbis lived. They lived during the times of the Second Temple. But a lot of the ones that we also think of are as important lived after the Temple and never saw it. So the Talmudic times goes to about the year 5 or 600 on our calendar. 5 or 600, not BCE, 5 or 600. And it started around the year, let's say sometime in the 3rd century BCE or something like that, where there were no more prophets anymore, there were only rabbis. Now, this period of time, there was also some change introduced in liturgy. The main things that came at this time were the Psukei de Zimra, blessings, the idea of formal reading of Tehillim, which is what we're really doing when we do Psukei de Zimra. When we have these verses of praise, we're not just reading Psalms. Everybody always read Psalms. But we're taking certain selections. We're saying a blessing before. We're saying a blessing after. It's a formal reading that's done every day. This came in Talmudic times. The Birchot HaShachar that we say, the whole list, Matir Asurim, Bokeach Ivrim, all of the whole list that we said in page 1 to 18, all of this comes from the times of the Talmud. So if you're reading chronologically, there's no relationship between the chronological reading of the Siddur and the chronology of the history, because you basically had periods of evolution in the Siddur, and that's not even the end of it. So
who's doing that? Is this the men of the Great Assembly also?
Now what happens is the men of the Great Assembly was a certain period,
right?
And that body of rabbis eventually, gave way to history, and there was no longer a body like that anymore. And so the rabbis later on still had the authority to enact changes in the liturgy. So they made blessings. They made the Brachot HaShachar. They made the blessings of the verses of praise, the Psukei Tezimra, and they added certain things to the Siddur. So the first actual Siddur to be published was about the 8th century. Amram Gaon and Sadia Gaon had Siddur.
Isn't it started before that? After the exile, the second time of the exile, all when you read, the Agada,
Right.
Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Gamliel,
Right. Yeah.
The five.
They had a Haggadah and everything.
Rabbanim,
Right.
they put everything together and they started the halacha actually.
Just those rabbis?
Yeah.
No, because in the Mishnah, many of the rabbis mentioned in the Mishnah lived during the Beit Sheni. Well, it was still around.
Yeah, but they took everything together.
That there was a certain time, but that was much later. The Mishnah, for example, was compiled around the year 200, which is already almost 107, 130 years. That's the oral tradition that they codified the laws. That was like 130 years after the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed.
No, I'm talking about in the beginning. I'm talking about Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi...
שקוראים בהגדה.
Right. These all lived at, but the rabbis you're mentioning, they all lived at different times.
Of the second temple.
Right. But some of those rabbis that you mentioned lived during the Second Temple, and some lived after. They all lived at different times. We have them all in the Talmud, so it sounds like they all lived together. But that's like thinking that like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln lived together. They didn't. They're different.
No. I'm talking about the 5 rabbis. They left after Jerusalem was conquered by the Romans.
Right.
The Romans, they kick everybody else. They kick everybody out,
Mm-hmm.
and they ask to be in Yavne.
Right. The Yavne v'Chachameha and everything. Right.
So it was Yavne, Lud, and Bnei Brak. They put everything together and they started halacha.
They didn't start it; they already had it before. Many of the things were already before.
But because they thought
they were trying to save it.
They saved
right.
it.
That's true. But many of these things already existed; they just weren't written.
Of course,
right? They weren't
there
written.
was existence.
There was no writing. So, and even Siddur, which is what we're focusing on mainly, the Siddur wasn't written down by anybody until the times of the Geonim, which is already, you're talking about the 8th century, the 9th century, we had the first Siddurim. And these Siddurim, if you look at them, are in some ways much sparser than our Siddurim. There's a lot less in them. And in some ways there's more. Like certain brachot that they have are very long and much more expansive than our version. Our version might be shorter. But more overall, their Siddurim are very short, and they have like a lot of explanation in them. They're not meant to be opened and read. They're more meant to be studied, and they exist even today. Rambam, who was living in the 11th or the 12th century, also has a Siddur. The Siddur of Rambam is basically exactly what the Teimanim have even today.
Yeah.
The Siddurim go back very, to olden days. But they weren't written until hundreds of years after these tefillot were already being said. In other words, in the Talmudic times, in the times of the Beit Sheni, let's say the year 0 or the year 300 BCE, they were saying the Amidah, but nobody ever wrote down the Amidah until like 1,000 years later, let's say.
So what was
So it was a
what were they saying it from? What were they
So
saying
that's
it
the
from?
thing. So what we talked about last time, for those who remember, so what practice that we have in the synagogue shows this historical problem that they didn't have Siddurim?
The repetition of the prayers.
So it was
The most important is repetition of the Amidah. Only certain biki'im, only experts like the Chazan knew the tefillot by heart. So they said everything allowed. That's why in the Sephardic communities, everything is allowed. Because they knew people didn't know it by heart. Especially not the Amidah. But the Amidah is supposed to be silent. Okay, so we have to repeat it then afterwards for everyone who doesn't know it. Later when Siddurim came out, what did they still not have when Siddurim came out though? There was still a problem.
Couldn't read it.
No, everyone could read. Because they all read the Torah. What did they have what was the problem? How many Siddurim did you have in a community?
to understand them.
Maybe one.
Right.
But, you didn't have a printing press, so you needed someone to write out hand by hand the entire manuscript of a Siddur, and that cost a lot of money if you were going to get it. And plus, it has mistakes on it. You need to write it. So forget it. They didn't have Siddurim. So how many Siddurim are they going to have in one community? Maybe one, maybe two. So still, until the times of printed books, okay, they really had this problem was a real problem. Now, in the nowadays, it seems, why are we repeating? It's not necessary, but in those days, it was a real need. They really didn't have an ability to, especially imagine Yom Kippur, how long it is, Rosh Hashanah. You have to remember all of that, or you have one guy who has a Siddur that's all those pages. I mean, it would be difficult for us to imagine. So, historically, this is the way that it evolved, and even after. So, just to give you a little bit more history. So even after the times of the Talmud, there were still things added. For example, in the Psukei de Zimra that we have, the verses of praise. Yes.
The Talmud time, can you tell us the time?
Up to about the year 500 or 600.
200 BC.
200 until the Mishnah,
400,
and then another 300 or 400 years of Gemara, and then the time of the Geonim is until about the 10th century, 9th or 10th century. So, even in the times of the, for example, there are some brachot in the morning. Just to tell you an interesting historical phenomenon. If you look at the beginning on page 2, if you have a Siddur, so these blessings are all in the Talmud. All of these blessings are written in the Talmud, meaning that were written down explicitly in Masechet Brachot and the Tractate Brachot. They're in the Talmud. All of these blessings except for one. The one that's not in the Talmud is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth blessing. Baruch atah Hashem Eloheinu melech haolam hanoten laya'ef koach. He who gives to the strength to the weary. To the weary. This blessing is not mentioned in the Talmud. Its first appearance is in the Siddurim of the Geonim, meaning after the times of the Talmud, all of a sudden this blessing appears. And so some of the rabbis said, hey, who do you think you are? This blessing was never in the Talmud. So they were against it. And so like Maimonides writes, you can't say this blessing. Even the Shulchan Aruch says you can't say this blessing. Who came up with this blessing? It came out of nowhere, but it became an accepted part of the Siddur, even though it was introduced even after the Talmud. And most people thought of the Talmud as the last canonical work of law. After the Talmud, you can't add anything. You can interpret the Talmud, you can try to be creative in understanding the Talmud, but you can't change what the Talmud says or add a blessing using Hashem's name. How could you do that? So these blessings are all, and in the Talmud, it correlates them, like we said last time, with different activities in the morning. Opening of your eyes, sitting up in bed, standing on the floor. The rest of the blessings in here are all mentioned in the Talmud. So that's something that you do see little additions here or there, blessings that weren't there before, certain blessings that we take for granted that we might say aren't written anywhere explicitly in the Talmud. Now, another thing that happened over time in various communities was the verses of praise, the Psukei de Zimra. So initially, if you look at early Siddurim, the number of psalms that were included was smaller, and over history, expanded. So Shabbat, somebody said, I don't know who said it, but communities said, we have more time, we'll say more. And holidays, they added more. Yom Kippur at a Sephardic synagogue, it's very long. The Psukei de Zimra in the morning of Yom Kippur is like a half hour of reading of Psalms. All of these things happened over time because there was no fixed limit to it. In other words, it's not a blessing where you feel you're taking God's name in vain if you say these extra psalms. You can say as many psalms as you want. Psalms are wonderful. So they added psalms. So the addition of psalms is something that happened over hundreds of years and varies from community to community. So some psalms that are said in the Ashkenazic community are not said in the Sephardic. Some that are said in the Sephardic are not said in the Ashkenazic. On Shabbat, let's say, for example, there are real differences between communities because this is something that happened locally. Somebody would be inspired to add. We don't have that kind of improvisation today in our tefillot. If somebody improvises, they say, "Oh, you're reform." What are you? People don't like that. But it used to be that people would get up and they would improvise. And the Talmud even talks about people who would get up. A chazan would get up and improvise, and the rabbi would say, "Hey, that was a bad improvisation," or "I liked it," or he would give his seal of approval. Yeah.
I read once in a book by Aryeh Kaplan, the original form of prayer was meditation. Mm-hmm. And that they had meditation academies where people would go to study and learn. It was replaced eventually because the average person couldn't learn how to meditate, so they put in a formal prayer system.
I've heard that from the same source. I don't know where he gets that from. I mean, the Rambam says that they used to pray, but you would express yourself.
We would take the Hasidim or the
right. But like with a nigun or something like that, where there's no words.
They spend an hour in Svat. There's a synagogue where they spend 2 hours meditating before they start to pray.
Well, that's even in the Talmud. The Talmud says that Rabbi Akiva would meditate for an hour, then
That's
pray
what
for
Sheldon
an
does.
hour, and then meditate for another hour afterwards. So they would spend 9 hours. So now there are some blessings here and there that were enacted later, like for example, the blessings on doing mitzvot, like we say Al Natilat Yadayim, or we say Al Mikra Megillah, or Lishmoa Kol Shofar. The blessings that we say on various mitzvot appear in the Talmud in a later strata of the Talmudic literature. So at a certain point, perhaps they weren't as widespread or they weren't formalized, and the rabbis instituted those blessings. But be that as it may, you have layers and you have things that evolved. And then what you have, and this is sort of the last wave, is you have the influx of Kabbalah. And the influence of Kabbalah on prayer is, of course, going to depend heavily on the influence of Kabbalah in that area, in that community. So, for instance, in certain parts of Germany and Lithuania, Kabbalah didn't have much of an influence. Or in communities where there was a backlash against Kabbalah. For example, in the Spanish-Portuguese communities that were very upset about Shabtai Tzvi, and they were very upset about all this, so they purged any kind of Kabbalistic content from their Siddurim. They didn't want anything to do with any mysticism or Kabbalah that could lead to any messianic stuff. Yeah, so if you look at the Spanish-Portuguese Siddur, almost nothing from Zohar or Kabbalah is found in the Spanish-Portuguese Siddur.
But it started,
But that's what I'm saying. There was a backlash because of Shabtai Tzvi. They were so upset, they said, this is dangerous stuff we wanted.
When Shabtai Tzvi was...
When did Shabtai Tzvi?
16th century.
Yeah, 16th century. Yeah.
Oh,
So there was a lot of
pushback.
pushback. He was a Turkish false messiah, false Mashiach, who was very heavily rooted in the Kabbalah. The people it was a period in Jewish history where there was a lot of depression and people were demoralized, and he came with this Kabbalistic idea of, we're going to be redeemed and I'm going to save you, and in the end he led a whole group, but then he converted to Islam, and it was just it was a bad ending.
And it took him like 5,000 families.
Yeah, there's still some people who believe in him, but he was just another false messiah. So they saw the danger of Kabbalah, because Kabbalah can be with a charismatic personality, and the Kabbalah, it's very dangerous. So they wanted to get away from that. So if you look at, obviously, any Siddur prior to the popularization of Kabbalah, like any Siddur before, let's say, the 15th century, of course it doesn't have any Kabbalah, because there was nothing there was no Zohar out before the 1300s. There was no, and even when the Zohar came out, it was only for Chachamim. It was only for the greatest rabbis. Average people didn't know what was written in there. But when it started becoming popular, when it started becoming popular in the 16th century, so then it made its way into the Siddur in many ways. And there were two key ways that it came into the Siddur. One was the language of certain prayers that was simpler became more complicated. So even some blessings, let's say in the Amidah, that in the original form were very short, words were added, phrases were added that had symbolic significance or had number significance,
For instance,
or had Kabbalistic. So I'll give you an example. In our Siddur, a very good example is if you look on page 35, a quick example, the blessing for knowledge, where we ask for knowledge, which is the first request that we make in the prayers in the Amidah. The first request. It's right here where it says, "You favor man with perception." In English, it says, "You favor man with perception, and you teach humankind understanding." In Hebrew, it's "Ata chonen ladam dat u'melamed enosh bina." That's from the original form. But then it says, "V'chonenu mitecha," give us from yourself. And it says in our Siddur, it says, "De'ah u'bina v'haskel," give us knowledge, understanding, and insight. Okay. If you look at the bottom, it says, some say chokhmah bina v'da'at, which at the very bottom, the footnote number 4. Okay, now why is that significant? Now you might say, well, that's not so there's just different variations. The fact is that any Siddur influenced by Kabbalah, which is 99% of Sephardic Siddurim, this is a unique one because it's Turkish, and the Turkish are influenced very much by the Spanish Portuguese. So they retained some of the pre-Kabbalistic language. So the pre-Kabbalistic language was De'ah u'bina v'haskel. Kabbalah came along and said, no, we want Chokhmah bina v'da'at because that has Kabbalistic, that's Chabad. Chokhmah bina v'da'at, that's what Chabad stands for.
You have to explain, this is
the Sfirot. Yeah. It has to do with Sfirot, with the divine influences, but that's Kabbalah.
Yeah.
In other words, the whole idea of the Sfirot in Kabbalah, which has to do with the divine influences and mysticism, that's what's referred to in Chokhmah bina v'da'at. So you in a Siddur like this, which is relatively not too heavy on Kabbalah, so you see that they put as a footnote. But in 99% of Sephardic Siddurim, it's Chokhmah bina v'da'at, and also in Chabad. Why? Because that's the Kabbalistic. They changed it to the Kabbalistic one. Now, it doesn't really impact the meaning. That's why they were able to do that. It doesn't change the meaning. The meaning is the same. But the selection of terms differs because they wanted, or sometimes they'll take out a vav. Or I'll give you another example where Kabbalah influence, it's not really the prayers, but let's just look quickly at the Kiddush. Kiddush is another very classic place where it's been changed. Look at 191. Page 191. This is just to illustrate to you how the liturgy, how prayers were changed by Kabbalah. Page 191. In the Kiddush, we say, now first of all, Yom HaShishi Vayichulu HaShamayim. Why do we say Yom HaShishi? Why don't you just say Vayichulu HaShamayim V'ha'aretz V'chol Tzva'am? Because we want to spell out the name of Hashem. Yom HaShishi Vayichulu HaShamayim. Look how they even made the letters big. Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. Because that's Kabbalah. Why do you have to say Yom HaShishi? That's from the previous sentence. It's not Yom HaShishi, it's not the 6th day, it's Yom HaShavi, 7th day. Why? Because of Kabbalah. Now, but the more important thing is... Okay. Yom HaShishi.
Yeah, okay, but Yom, what do you mean it's...
Yom HaShishi is not part of the Pasuk. That's why there's a period after the word Yom HaShishi. Look, there's a period.
Yeah.
Right? Why are you saying two words? Look where it says the 6th day. Look at the English. The 6th day, period. Right. So Yom HaShishi is not really part of the verse, but they added it in because of Kabbalah. They wanted to make the name of God.
And actually, when you
But
say
I saw that because it was Yom.
No. When you say the Kiddush, you're supposed to say Yom HaShishi.
Quietly, because it's not really part of the
The
Pasuk.
Yom is the meaning. Yom is the Yud.
Yud, Yom. HaShishi is Hey.
Okay.
Vayichulu is Vav.
Okay.
Hashamayim is Hey. Yud,
Okay.
but the Yom HaShishi is not really part of the sentence. They put it in because they wanted to make the Yud and Hey.
Okay.
Now, that's not even the biggest thing. Look at the paragraph of Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvotav v'ratzavanu v'shabbat kodsho be'avav ratzon henchilanu zikaron le'maaseh v'reshit techila le'mikrei kodesh dechel l'tziat mitzrayim. And then what do we say? V'shabbat kodshecha be'avav ratzon henchaltanu. That's the Sephardic style. Why? Really, it should say Kivanu b'charta v'yotanu kidashta mikol ha'amim, which is Ashkenazi. Kivanu b'charta v'yotanu kidashta. It's out. Why? Because Kabbalah said there should only be a certain number of words in this paragraph. Because the numerical value, in other words, the number of words in the paragraph has a symbolic meaning. And so we need to get rid of that sentence because it ruins the Kabbalah. It ruins the mystical meaning. So that's why they cut out Kivanu b'charta v'yotanu kidashta mikol ha'amim. Really, that's in the original. They took it out because they wanted the Kabbalah. So I'm just giving you an example. So, that's an instance of where Kabbalah comes in. And if you look at a Sephardic Siddur in Hebrew, you will see that many of the words, there's all kinds of Kabbalistic things in parentheses around it. Because the words in the Amidah, the structure of the Amidah was fixed. That there have to be 19 blessings. But the exact words, you can add an extra word here, subtract an extra word here. Almost no two Siddurim are exactly alike. Not Ashkenaz and not Sephardic. Almost no two Siddurim are exactly alike. There's different words, variations in wording in paragraphs. And the Mekubalim, the Kabbalists, knew that, so they came and they said, oh, well, if we can we'll add this hint to this Kabbalistic idea, and over here...
So you're saying these changes were made in about the 16th century?
And on.
There on.
Yeah, and if you look...
Because of the Zohar and the Sephardim were more connected...
It wasn't the Zohar so much. The Zohar came out in the 13th century.
Yeah, the Zohar came
and it was only for scholars. But then what happened was in the 16th century with the Arizal, the Lurianic Kabbalah, the concept was Kabbalah is for everybody. So why are we only studying Kabbalah in our yeshivot? We should go and put it in the Siddur for everybody. Mm-hmm. So they started to take the Kabbalah and to inject it into the Siddur and to change the words and to add words and to subtract words, to have symbolic references to Kabbalah. Now what's the most obvious aspect of Kabbalah in the Siddur, the one that you can't miss, is when we take the Torah out and we read Baruch Shemei Demarei Alma. Baruch Shemei Demarei Alma is what we read when we open the Sefer Torah, which is on page, it's only on Shabbat, so it's on, in here it would be on page 235, at the bottom of the page. This is literally a segment out of the Zohar. That's what it is. It's a segment out of the Kabbalah. 235. So if you look at, for instance, Siddurim that come from communities where they were expunging Kabbalah from the Siddur, they won't have it. Because they didn't want that. Because it's bringing Kabbalistic doctrines into the mainstream. And they were against.
All the prayer books have this now?
Nowadays, it's rare to find it, but you can find in some communities of, purist communities that they don't have it. They don't have Baruch Shemei because they don't want to have any reference to Kabbalah. It's not necessarily because they think Kabbalah is bad. They might say Kabbalah is fine for Kabbalists, but it's not for everybody.
This is also Aramaic.
It's in Aramaic. The Zohar is in Aramaic. And part of the reason for that was the Zohar is completely in Aramaic. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One reason is because it's more secretive. Because, because a regular person who knows Hebrew
can be secretive to many
right, but an average Hebrew reader can understand Hebrew, but they can't understand the Zohar. The other reason is because in the Talmud and the Midrash, the Zohar is presented as the words of the Chachamim from the Talmud, who they spoke Aramaic. The Midrash is written in Aramaic, so it's written in the same language as the Midrash.
And the Zohar is about what?
It's a mystical. It's a work of Kabbalah. It is the textbook of Kabbalah. Right. And what it is, it's written as. I'll tell you how it's presented. So basically, we have a genre of literature called Midrash. Midrash is commentary on the Tanakh, rabbinic commentary on Tanakh. So, for example, if you're reading Bereshit and you're reading about Abraham, and you open up the book of Midrash. On the verses that talk about Abraham, the rabbis will have all kinds of commentaries about his backstory, what was his childhood like, where did he go next, all kinds of additional stories and other commentaries and additional ideas. So Zohar is written as a midrash on the Torah.
Okay.
So you can open up the Zohar on Bereshit, but instead of, let's say, commenting like a midrash does on the stories, on the meaning, on what was the background to this situation, what did he really mean, that type of thing. It goes into the mystical hints in the story.
Okay.
Oh, really, Abraham did this because he was referring to this mystical idea, or it's representative or symbolic of this mystical idea. So it's like a midrash, but it's a midrash on a different level.
I see. But it's still on the Tanakh.
It's still on the Torah. It's on the Torah mainly. But it spins off of it. So instead of taking the stories at face value and expanding on them, it takes all the stories as you might say a platform to go into the mystical doctrines.
How did the rabbis know the stories behind
The story.
The story behind the story, right.
Right.
So there are two ways, I would say.
I mean, did they just...
It would be great to one time, like actually for the Foundation of Jewish Studies a couple of years ago, I did a series on what is Midrash. And it was a great series. The people, they really enjoyed it, and they asked me to come back to do some more things because of that. Midrash in and of itself requires like a whole separate series to learn how to understand it and how to approach it. But basically, Midrash, like the stories behind the stories, there's two ways. One is by tradition. In other words, there were certain traditions that we passed down. Even today, we don't necessarily know where we got it, but your dad told you, that Abraham smashed the idols in his father's shop. It's something that's passed down.
Right.
You never saw it written.
Right.
Now, it's written in the Midrash. You can open the book and it's in there, but 99% of Jews who know the story about Abraham smashing the idols, they never saw it inside a book. They heard it. So, the rabbis had it as a tradition. What? Right, it's oral tradition. Or how did Abraham discover God? That he grew up in an idolatrous culture. He looked at the sun, he looked at the moon. All those kinds of stories about how he discovered God, they were part of tradition. Another way that sometimes Midrash is not intended as historical, but it's more intended to convey a lesson. So in those cases, it might not be that the rabbis heard a backstory so much as that they are trying to convey a point by creating a story. So my favorite example of this is when Lot is saved from the city of Sodom. So it says that it was Passover that day. How do I know it was Passover? Because he baked matzah. He baked matzah for the angels who came. Right? So that's an example of a kind of fanciful story, because of course Lot lived before the time of Passover. He didn't know what it was Passover. And but if you look at the story of if you have that Midrash, and now you look at the story of Lot, you realize Lot was leaving a place which was being judged by God. A terrible plague was coming upon there. Everybody was dying. And he was running out. It's exactly like Passover. He had like his own personal Passover. And what was his test? Is he going to move fast enough to get out of there or not? Right? The angel said, you'd better rush. And what did the Jews? They left in a rush. So there's a lot of similarity between the two stories. You might not have noticed the similarity if the rabbis hadn't made a story out of the story that, it was really Passover and all that. So they bring that to light by doing that. So sometimes it's a literary device. But in any case, so that is, these are the strata in the Siddur. We have our Moshe Rabbeinu, we have King David, we have Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, which is kind of pre-Talmud. We have Talmud. We have the Geonim. We have communities after the time that the Jews left Israel and Babylonia and spread out, who evolved their own additions and subtractions from the Siddur. And then we have, as a major force in modern Siddur, is Kabbalah. Kabbalah is a major, major force. So, for example, everyone here has heard of Sephardic, but sometimes you'll hear somebody say, you'll see a Siddur and it says Sephard, not Sephardic, Sephard. What is Sephard? Sephard is actually the Siddur of the Arizal. The Arizal was a major Kabbalist, a major Kabbalist in the 16th century. Right. He had his own. He was actually half Sephardic, half Ashkenazi. His mother was Sephardic, his father was Ashkenazi. He grew up in the Ashkenazi community, but he said the Sephardic tefillah is more correct according to Kabbalah. So he basically took Sephardic Siddur, made it a little bit more palatable to the Ashkenazic community, and so that's why a lot of Sephardim, they go to Chabad, to the Lubavitch, the Chabad, and they're very comfortable because 99% of the Chabad is Sephardic. It's not 100, very close, because they follow the Arizal, and the Arizal basically took the Sephardic because he said it was more Kabbalistically correct. However, the other thing that he said, however, on high holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, Ashkenazi is more Kabbalistically correct. So that's why in the Chabad, it's much more Ashkenazi for the holidays, and it's Sephardic for the weekdays and Shabbat. So it's an interesting mix that they have. But that's an example of the influence of Kabbalah. And he developed a lot of the liturgy. He added a lot of phrases, a lot of extra hints, a lot of, you need this number of words in this paragraph, so I'm going to add some more words. You need to subtract words over here. So it's a very different Siddur as a result of that influence, particularly of the Arizal in the 16th century, had a huge influence on the Siddur as we know it today. But then since then, you really haven't had the next big players in Siddur, I have to say, are like basically Art Scroll.
Yeah.
Because Art Scroll Company came along and said, 100 years ago, not even, 50 years ago, you could go into any Ashkenazi synagogue and they had a different Siddur. They didn't have the same. The Hungarians had a Hungarian, the Polish had a Polish Siddur, the Germans had a German. It wasn't the same. Art Scroll came along and said, we're going to have one Ashkenazi.
Who's Art Scroll?
Art Scroll is a company.
The publisher.
A company, a publisher.
publishing
They
company.
decided,
Publishing
we're
company.
gonna make everything, we're gonna homogenize everything. Yeah.
What
And
about
they
the
did that.
Jews who weren't Sephardic and weren't Ashkenaz?
Right, so they have their own. So, for example,
They
the
have-
Romaniot Jews, for example, they have their
The
own
Yemen-
liturgy.
Yemen-
The Yemenites have their own
And
And the
liturgy.
Indians?
Indians have their own. All these communities, even the Iranians who lived in Iran, had their own. So,
I don't-
but the Teimanim, basically, what's interesting about Yemen, just as a historical
Different.
aside, is that there are two communities in Yemen. There's what's called the Baladi and the Shami. So the Baladi stayed pure Yemenites. Okay? The Shami were influenced by the mainstream Sephardic. Because Sephardic rabbis from, let's say, the Middle East, other parts of the Middle East,
They call
came
it
to
Shami.
Yemen, Shami.
Shami.
Shami is probably
Yeah.
from Syria.
Maybe they were influenced, but no, they were originally Yemenite. But Sephardic rabbis from the Middle East came and influenced them. So, for instance, basically the Baladi follow Maimonides 100%. 100% they follow Rambam, which means they follow from the 12th century, a very short Siddur. If you look at the Siddur of Baladi, it's this big, there's not that much. There's no addition, it's the same. All of the customs. They don't have the Omer that we keep, the Omer where we don't get married. They don't have that because the Rambam doesn't have that. They're living in the 12th century. They don't know, in terms of their halacha. The Shami, they adopted from the mainstream Sephardic. So they do the Omer, they adopted all the Kabbalistic stuff in the Siddur. So their Siddur is almost like a regular Sephardic Siddur. Whereas the Baladi, they have the pure, original, 1,000-year-old Siddur. So there's a split in that community. And there were wars between, for example, Rav Kafach, who was the very famous Yemenite rabbi who died a few years ago, very famous, very erudite rabbi. His grandfather openly was at war with the Kabbalistic rabbis. He didn't want them, and he said this is idolatry, and we don't want this mysticism, and go away. And there was a huge fight between them. But that's why you have two different streams coming.
That's why we are community.
Yeah.
To fight.
You have to fight.
Right.
Right. So that's that. So these far-flung communities had their own. Moroccan community had their own Siddur. Now they came to Israel. So just like what Art Scroll Publisher tried to do in America, is what basically Chacham Ovadia tried to do in Israel. So the Iraqis came with their Siddur, which was unique. It was the Ben Ish Chai, made by the Ben Ish Chai, great Sephardic rabbi. Very Kabbalistic. The Syrians came with theirs. The Moroccans came with theirs. The Iranians came with theirs. Everybody had variations. And Chacham Ovadia sat down and said, what? This is right, this is wrong, this is right, this is wrong, this is wrong. We're going to make our own Siddur that is the officially correct Siddur. Oh, that was your custom? That custom was wrong.
But this is still just for the Sephardim.
He tried to homogenize Sephardim. Right.
So did he make one Sephardim?
Yeah.
So nowadays he was extraordinarily successful in doing this, to the point that most Sephardim that have grown up in my generation have grown up that the Siddur is the one that Rav Ovadia.
So this is the Siddur that we have here?
And no, this is Turkish. So that Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, who was chief rabbi after Rav Ovadia, didn't like this. He was a Ben Ish Chai person. He tried to bring back the Ben Ish Chai. He said,
The Iraqi one.
Iraqi. And Rav Mesas, with the Moroccan, fought against Rav Ovadia. Very strong. He put out his own Siddur. I have it. He has very good Siddurim he put out. And there's a Moroccan community now that's still putting out their own Siddurim. It's called Darkei Avotenu. They put out their own Siddurim and their own things. And not I don't want to say against Rav Ovadia, but saying we're still keeping our thing. We're not going to lose, we're not going to succumb to the homogenization. And if you want to look at just one thing that's very interesting in the Siddur, just a word on page 37. The Turkish Siddur happens to have the way that Rav Ovadia says it's wrong.
Why do we have to use Siddur in this?
Because it was the best English translated, easiest to use English translated Siddur that was out. It really is. I mean, It's a very good one. And the English translation is pretty good. The Syrians have one too. The what's called orot. It's very good too. But people don't like it because it's linear.
Orot. Isn't that the red one?
Oh,
Yeah.
Red and white, right?
Yeah, I
The
like
red
that
one we used to have was.
Yeah, I like that one, but some people don't like the layout of the page. You know that it's linear. Anyway, if you look at the second, because it's supposed to have Hebrew English. It's Hebrew and English on every page.
I see.
So if you look on page 37, this is just a nuance of a detail, but it's just an interesting thing. So the second paragraph is the blessing against heretics. Now this is also this is also an interesting thing because the original Amidah had only 18 blessings. That's why it's called Shmona Esrei. But at the time that Christianity began as a movement, when it started to become a pernicious influence, you could say, on the Jewish community, was about the third century, or second or third century. And so at that time, there were a lot of what we don't understand this today. Now we have Jews for Jesus; they're not really Jewish, but
right.
they had, Christianity was a Judaic sect. It was a sect of Jews. They all kept kosher.
They called
Jewish Christians, right? Judeo-Christians or Jewish Christians. They kept kosher. They did Brit Milah. They kept Shabbat. They did everything.
To be a Christian, you have to be Jewish first.
In the beginning, you did, yeah. That was the early church had a big argument about that. So you will find in early church fathers up to the 8th or 9th century still saying, stop going to synagogue, to their churches. Stop going to synagogue, stop keeping Passover, stop. That's why they changed it so that Easter can't fall on Passover, because they would try to combine them, because the Jews stop keeping Shabbat, you're doing the wrong thing.
They were confused and they were worried about them going back to full Judaism.
Right, they don't want to make distinctions. It's not just that, it's also that according to Saint Paul, keeping the law is a rejection of Jesus, because you're saying that he didn't redeem you from the law. The whole idea of Jesus is he saved you from having to observe the law. The law is of the body, and Jesus is of the spirit. And you're saying that you want to live the religion of the body by doing these commandments. You have to go with Jesus. So they were against the law. So these early Christians had an influence, and they knew the Bible, and they would talk to the people. So they made a blessing of Lambinim v'Lamalshinim. What's the reason why they made this blessing? Well, one reason was because it was an actual threat to the spiritual vitality of the community. But another reason was it was a litmus test for the Chazan. If a Chazan went up and he skipped this blessing, you said, that guy doesn't want to say anything against the sectarians.
He's already on with the Christians.
He's on the other side. He's playing for the other team. He doesn't want to say it, right? So that's how they would. So if somebody skipped that blessing, they got him out of the being a chazan. Now there's a word at the end. So what is the closing of the blessing? Shover oyevim umachnia minim is what we have in our Siddur. There is two versions. There's shover oyevim, which means to break the enemies. Umachnia zedim, and he humbles. The zedim means people who are wanton, arrogant people. Okay, minim means heretics. Okay, so it has a different nuance. Zedim means people who are like arrogantly rebellious, and minim just means more like people who are heretical. They believe false things. Now, if you look at ancient Siddurim, most of them, the vast majority, have the word zedim. That's the truth. They have the word zedim. But there are a lot of Sephardic Siddurim that have the word minim. And this was influenced by a great rabbi named Nechida. Nechida, a great, he's actually Moroccan, but a great rabbi that influenced all the Sfaradim. Even though he was Moroccan, he influenced everybody. Everybody, I'm saying he wasn't just local. He was recognized by everybody. So even though he lived in Morocco, he had a great influence. Yeah, very big influence. So his writings influenced everybody. So the Persians, they also have minim. Many of the communities, the Sephardic Middle Eastern communities, the Ben Ish Chai, minim. The Iraqis, minim. They took from the Chida. So what happened was, Rav Ovadia was asked, what's the correct thing? And he said, absolutely not minim, it has to be zedim.
Zedim.
He wanted to change he said that's the original, all the early manuscripts have zedim, this is not the right thing, it's based on Kabbalah, but it's not the right thing. And so a lot of Sephardic communities said, no, we've always been saying minim, what do you mean? And I was in just an anecdote. I was for the summer when I was on my sabbatical in a kollel. It was mostly Persian, just because it was in Great Neck, most of it Persian. And so the prayer was minim, and if anybody said zedim, the Rosh Yeshiva got very angry, because he said, even though he respected Rav Ovadia, he said our tradition was always minim, not zedim. The Moroccan tradition also minim, not zedim. But since Rav Ovadia came out, now it's very, less and less Siddurim are putting this version. Because
any argumentative debates between these different opinions?
Well, what happened was you need somebody to argue your case who's seen as able to go toe-to-toe with the big leagues, And so who's going to go toe-to-toe with Rav Ovadia Yosef? The only person who could really do it was Harav Misas. Rav Misas, he did. He wrote entire books saying why Rav Ovadia was wrong, and about everything. Anything that Rav Ovadia said. Rav Ovadia had two groups
Where
that
was
he really.
from?
Rav Ovadia,
Yeah.
Originally
Oh,
Iran. But there were two groups that he persecuted the most in terms of trying to change their custom. Number one was the Iraqis themselves, because he said they deviated from the original Sephardic way of 500 years ago, and they got all this Kabbalah, and they got influenced by Ashkenazi things, and it's not that we have to go back to the original, not the Ben Ish Chai. The Ben Ish Chai, even though he was in his time, 100 years ago, the Ben Ish Chai was how people speak of Rav Ovadia Yosef today. He was the big Sephardic rabbi. He said he's wrong about a lot of things. He went to the Ashkenazi way. So he was against that. And then with the Moroccans, oh boy. He was so... They couldn't do anything right, Now the Moroccans who grew up in Israel, they all grew up as students of Rav Ovadia, so they left their own thing. But like Harav Amar, who was the chief rabbi that just finished, he's Moroccan. But you wouldn't know from anything, you wouldn't know because he follows Rav Ovadia 100%. But the earlier Moroccan rabbis who really stuck with the Moroccan tradition, like Harav Misas, they were recognized as great rabbis, but they wrote long responsa and entire books. I have books in my house. I have books written by these rabbis defending all these customs that Rav Ovadia said is wrong. Kissing in the synagogue, wrong. You're not allowed to ever kiss anybody in the synagogue, Rav Ovadia. Even men kissing men.
I think Rabbi Kasurla didn't want us to do that.
Even on the hand?
Way back.
So he said, well, if your father goes up for an aliyah, you can kiss his hand. That's it.
Yeah.
But so things like that, or saying a bracha on the Hallel of Rosh Chodesh. He said you can't. There are many, many things or the fact that women said a bracha on the lulav. That was never a Sephardic custom, and most Sephardim didn't do that, but the Moroccans did. So the Moroccans had a lot of customs that they were very strong in. There was very, and there are arguments for them. There's a basis for them. There's a basis for all of them in Hagim. But Chacham Ovadia said this. He had two. His real goal was he wanted one united Sephardic Judaism in Israel. That's what he wanted. And and what did he use as leverage? He said, we're all going to go back to this code called the Shulchan Aruch that was written in the 1500s. We're all going to go back to that. We're all just going to agree on that. Any deviations, we're going to get rid of. So that was he was trying to steer everybody back to that. So Moroccans had a lot of their own minhagim, Iraqis did. He said, we got to get rid of those and all come to, or for example, when do you say the bracha when you light Shabbat candles?
When?
Right, when? So the Shulchan Aruch says first you say the blessing, then you light the candles. But what's the Moroccan custom? What's the Iraqi custom for the Ben Ish Chai? Light the candles, cover eyes. They do the way the Ashkenaz do.
That's what I do.
The way that the Iraqis and the Moroccans was doing was the way the Ashkenaz do. But the way that the Shulchan Aruch actually says is the opposite way. And that's the way the Syrians mostly were doing it. And so everything he really tried to just basically homogenize everything.
Did he achieve his goal?
I would say he achieved his goal in many ways. Number one, because he was such a towering personality that people followed along with it. All the Sephardic rabbis in Israel are now his students. So it's much harder to have dissent. Before you had really big Sephardic rabbis who were completely independent of him, the Moroccan rabbis, like Rav Misas, that everybody respected. Now all the new generation of Moroccan rabbis, they all studied under him. They're not going to get up and go against him.
So it gives Sephardim more power. In
It
the,
gives them more
nation.
unity,
More
but
unity.
you lose a lot of the beauty of these
Individual.
customs. Yeah, it's a loss.
Centralized almost.
So there are some
But
hardcore
it's not
Moroccans who are
custom,
trying to keep it
it's a
alive.
custom.
There's some hardcore Moroccans that are really devoted. There's some hardcore Iraqis that are trying to keep
So
it alive.
there's two versions of the Shulchan Aruch, right? There's a Sephardic and...
The Shulchan Aruch itself is written by Rav Yosef Karo, who's Sephardic.
Right.
Rav Moshe Isserles, at the same time, was writing his own. What they did was they first both wrote long commentaries on a previous code. They were both writing conclusions in the form of a handbook. And since the Sephardic one was printed first, the Ashkenazic rabbi said, instead of printing my own book, I'm just going to print what I wrote as glosses on that. So it was combined into one book, but there's both views are represented. And that's the story. So today's Siddur, no two Siddurim are alike. They have the same fundamental components.
You know, now I know.
But there's a lot of
when
history.
When I go to other
Synagogue.
and I open the Siddur, I said, oh my God, it's not like our Siddur at all. It's
There's a lot of variation. Right. I mean, the basic structure, though, will really... what we learned about in the class, the basic structure is always the same.
All the rest is different.
Yeah, but wordings here and there will be different. On high holidays, there's a lot of variation, too.
I grew up with Anshe Sfard,
Mm-hmm.
which is a blend.
It's like Nusach Sfard.
Ashkenaz, yeah,
Mhm.
Nusach Sfard.
Right. It's very similar to Sfard. In a lot of ways.
Yeah, the sequence of the verses
Mhm.
is so
It's very similar in that. It's like Chabad.
Beth
That's
Shalom
very
follows
interesting.
that.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting.
Yeah,
Very
they do.
interesting. You should have recorded this.
I thought we were going to have more
Well, you-
question answers.
So this is a perfect start.
Yeah, it's fantastic, but I see
It
those
sets the
words.
foundation.
Did you record it?
Did you record it?
Good.
Jonathan, give it to him.
I'm glad because I
Put
didn't.
it on the blog.
I didn't.
It's
So,
excellent.
did I say anything off color? No. I was speaking
No.
freely because I didn't think it was being recorded. No. I didn't want anyone
Yeah,
to be nervous
we're
about
gonna
asking.
take this to the prosecutor's office
Well,
tonight.
does
I didn't
anyone
wanna-
have any other questions?
I didn't want to
Ariane?
record it.
I
I
want
want
to
to
understand how,
Do you have any
when I
observations?
come on Shabbat to
We're in a
understand
wire.
what they
Did you
do
enjoy
first,
it?
what
Very
second, what
interesting.
third. But I was missing last class.
Yeah, last class. This really lays that out, and also the recording of the first class. You can get it and put it
I
online.
can email it.
You can send
yeah.
me the link, and then you can listen
You
to
can
that,
listen
and
to
it
the
goes through the
rabbi's
whole
class
thing.
from
There
last
probably
week.
isn't one Jew in 1,000 who knows what you taught us tonight.
Yeah, it's
Some-
too
Nobody
yeah,
knows
this is
it.
very
Nobody knows the
unusual.
historical context.
Right. It's
Even
true.
people who are quote religious and pray every day, they don't know where this stuff comes from.
Right,
I
so
knew,
this was
I knew a little, but I learned a lot more than
Good. I'm
others.
glad. I'm glad. And if you could send me that recording, then I can
Yeah.
upload it.
Do that. Put it on your blog.
Unless maybe he wants to get like, thank you so much for coming.
All right,
Great
so
class.
let's
See you at the next
start.
class.
Thank you.
So, as a